All right, so this is the beginning of an unprecedented feat. This is going to be a complete series analysis of Suzumiya Haruhi, going through every chapter and every corresponding episode, if there is one. And this is going to be such an important thing because Suzumiya Haruhi is such an important work in the otaku canon. It's a very misunderstood work as well. Even if it is understood partially, they typically don't get the full picture. They don't get all its implications, all the subtext, or just how much is going on here. So I want to bring all that to light. And what I'm going to do is when there's an episode that corresponds to the chapter in question, in this case, we're going to go over chapter 1. Well, actually, chapter 1 plus some content to make it fit with the first episode. And I want to comment in real time on the episode so that you can pull up the episode if you have it available. You can watch along, or you can just look at, I'll have English subs on here so you can just get a gist of what I'm commenting on if need be. So basically, for this one, there's a couple things I want you to keep in mind while I go over this episode. First is about Kyon. Kyon is like the lost otaku. He's very much going to be extremely relatable to any otaku living in modern society, because he's essentially, he has no place in the world, really. And so he's just forced to acquiesce it. He's forced to accept clown world. He's forced to just suck it up and be normal. He's forced to be normal. But he hates being normal, but he's disciplined himself to accept it. And then I want you to think about Haruhi. And put simply, and I'm sure many of you have come to this conclusion yourself, Haruhi is very much a representative of true God. And I'm going to go over the most important traits of her and point out everything relevant to that and what's significant about her representation of that in the story. And then lastly, Haruhi is not a normal work in the straightforward sense. There's a lot going on meta-wise, and in some ways the story has some non-literal qualities to it. So wherever there's a narrative in Haruhi, there's also kind of a meta-narrative happening at the same time. So I want you to keep that in mind, and I'll comment on where that's relevant and explain exactly what I mean by that as it comes up. All right, so here we go. All right, so we start right in with Kyon's self-effacing stuff. He's, you notice he's really self-conscious about just topics of discussion. He's like, oh, what a dumb topic of discussion, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. He's very self-conscious. And you'll notice, the obvious gray world he lives in. Think back to, it's funny because a year after this novel was released, roughly, we got the VN clan ad, and then roughly a year after the anime aired, we got the anime clan ad. And they both have this, characters walking up the hill to school. Everything's gray. He's depressed. But you'll notice the difference in Haruhi is that we got this more ironic, jolly thing to it almost. And that's because Kyon he's a very ironic character. And his self-effacing is meant to capture that irony. He's defeated, and yet he's satisfied. He's satisfied in his defeat. And so, as you'll see, all the shots here are meant to just make Kyon look like he just doesn't belong. Like, all the shots single him out from his surroundings. Like, he's there, but he's just not there. And the narrative in the books are really good at conveying that too. He's just like, this shit sucks. All right. And so immediately Haruhi, right, lights everything up specifically with her introduction. Once this introduction settles into Kyon's brain, it's like, okay, it's, in a sense, if we're to take the grayness as his depression, in a sense, it's almost like, oh, his depression uplifts through Haruhi's introduction. And obviously that's on the physical level, that's a little too simple, but on the meta level, it's almost as if, okay, the healing of his depression is inevitable at this point. So it's as if his depression is cured in a sense. And on the meta level too, Haruhi is the character that's showing us like, oh, here's the presence of, here's an answer in this shitty clown world. Here's something to light it up. So that's not just Kyon's depression that's being lifted. It's actually also ours as the audience that's being lifted. And there's a couple things to note with this opening too. It's a very dense opening. There'll probably be a lot of things to point out every single time I watch an episode, but like right off the bat, you'll notice that it does everything it can to give you a real meta sense of everything. It's almost like an informational gallery more than like, you know, it treats the subjects you're seeing here almost with this, I don't want to say glibness, but there's this intentional glossing over of everything as if it's not so literal, more representational of something that it's being symbolic of. And again, this last little bit is great because it just really captures the different, you suddenly get this quick barrage of the different personas of Haruhi, the calm Haruhi, the excited Haruhi, all that shit. All right. Of course, Haruhi-ism, that's just genius. So, very significantly, Kyon is, of course, immediately attracted to her. And so he tries to make conversation. And you'll notice he does it in the absolute most self-conscious way possible because he's pretty savvy. He knows, like, okay, no one else is doing this. So I'm being weird by simply even talking to her. And he makes as much of an effort as possible to almost sort of like, his way of getting a power dominance over Haruhi is always to default to self-consciousness, which is actually kind of ironic because it's, you know, that's how he's been defeated. It's his defeat that led him to that self-consciousness. All right, and so the two friends are great. We got Taniguchi, who's essentially, he's a symbolic representative of like aggressive normal behavior. And then we got Kunikita, and he's like a symbolic representative of like passive normal behavior. And you'll notice as characters, there's this, they're charming because they're so, well, Kunikita is just straight up boring, and then Taniguchi is just a goofball, and in that way, he kind of essentially serves as a parody of normalness. With Kunikita also with serving as a parody, but just by being so boring. And so Kyon's kind of in this friendship circle with the two of them, representing his betweenness of those two, passive normalness, aggressive normalness. Kyon's just kind of plopped in there, just trying to embrace the normalness. And here's something we don't get in the books, where Kyon actually actively observes Haruhi during break time. And again, it's a little bit meta because there's almost like, you'll notice the way it cuts, like their conversation continues through the different transitions without, seamlessly. And he seems to always kind of have Haruhi in his view, and that's sort of like, it's more like it's more significant that he's thinking about Haruhi than he's actually, physically seeing her. And you'll get a lot of that technique in the show where you'll physically get something that's not necessarily supposed to be actually happening. It can represent instead just a psychological state, particularly of Kyon, since he's the narrator. And again, it's funny because with Haruhi, what you're going to get a lot too is you're going to get this interesting clashing in the world between, it's trying to represent and show you clown world, just shitty ass real world clown world that just sucks ass. But at the same time, it's also otaku world. And here we got like the bloomers, which is just, that screams otaku world. You notice Haruhi there, the way she sits apart from everyone. That's kind of like our indicator that Haruhi puts on a show. She's self-conscious of herself. She knows what she's doing. She's not self-conscious in the way Kyon is, but she is self-aware. And here's a very significant little piece of symbolism here, the hairstyle change. And I'll talk about that later. And here's another very significant trait, which is her lack of fear of being seen. In this case, physically. But that also corresponds to her lack of fear of being seen in any regard. She can't know shame or embarrassment no matter what. And that's something I'll talk about after. And then, of course, here is one of the most significant traits of her as well, which is she can do everything well. And she shows an active effort to do so by joining every club. Proof that she is essentially aware, or at least has a subconscious desire to flaunt her ability to do everything well. And that's a significant trait I'll talk about later. And notice how happy Kyon looks here walking to school now that he knows Haruhi's there. Kyon's name is his real name is never known. That's significant. I'll talk about that later as well. And notice what Haruhi says here. She says, "When did you notice that I have my hairstyle like this to ward off aliens?" And it's interesting because it's quite possible that she could have said that no matter what Kyon suggested it was for. Because you'll notice here when she even explains the significance of them symbolically, it doesn't really have anything to do with warding off aliens. It just has to do with days of the week. And so it's interesting because if you read into it a certain way, that can be our first hint that Haruhi doesn't really take what she's doing incredibly seriously. It's more of a show. It's a communication device. And here we get this great little stare down too, which is hilarious because this could happen between no other two characters in the show. Right off the bat, we get a hint that Kyon is in some way eccentric because no other character would have this kind of stare down like that. And so it's funny because, Haruhi's in tsundere mode right now. And it's interesting because, boom, she cuts her hair the next day. And that's sort of the warning that she's about to commit to her persona that we know for, the bulk of the series. The hair is a rotating form. It's a rotating persona, so to speak. She cuts it, commits to a single one. And you'll notice immediately she's being much, much more friendly with Kyon. She's pretty much committed to communicating with him. Especially since, if you know the story, she recognized that he might be John Smith, of course. This is significant. She criticizes the people who asked her out for not being manly enough, which is kind of a contradiction because she already said that she's not interested in them in the first place. And of course, Kyon answers by saying, I agree. That wasn't very manly of them to ask you out over the phone. I wouldn't have done that. Which she immediately shoots down. She immediately was like, oh, well, I don't care if you would have improved upon that. And it's interesting because even if Kyon tries to submit a little bit of masculinity toward her, she will just shoot it down because she's determined to just keep testing him. She is not going to be satisfied with Kyon's attempts at being masculine, even if it is, more than perhaps what she's used to at a given point in time. And of course, here we get we get Taniguchi making it clear how interested he is in Haruhi, how he's always paying attention to her, which is funny because, again, it kind of parodies the idea of, like, Haruhi is eccentric and essentially, in a form, an outcast. And Taniguchi is a representative of that culture, that sort of outcaster, but ironically, he's obsessed with her. He's infatuated with her, and which is an idea about how Haruhi is the thing everyone in clown world essentially tries to divert themselves from, even though it's essentially always on their mind. And so it's funny. It's interesting here the way Kyon, his attitude towards Asakura. He's blatantly attracted to her. He even says that explicitly in the books. But you notice he tries to play it cool. He tries to not be like Taniguchi. Kyon he's very self-conscious. He's very much crafted a persona for himself, and because of that, he doesn't have those slips of goofiness like Taniguchi has, where he'll act like a fool in front of a girl or something. And that's because his persona is very tempered. And it's funny here too because Kyon in the anime is a little more explicit about being like, oh, I really just want Haruhi to fuck off. And it's funny because, he knows full well Haruhi's his threat toward him maintaining his normalness. And obviously that's a scary factor to him. And that's the entire thing of his character arc, is his fear at losing his normalness. And it's funny here because Haruhi's being very cute with him here. She's being very flirty in her own kind of like, bitchy way. And this is funny because Kyon says something technically ambitious here, even though he says it in a little bit of a black pill fashion. And it's funny because this is our first glimpse that Haruhi is not naturally ambitious, because she didn't get inventive on her own. And that is interesting right there, the way she gets offended at him calling himself and her normal. Because obviously, we can guess why she wouldn't want herself to be called normal. But in general, we can definitely conclude that she's probably more offended at Kyon settling for normalness than him calling her normal. Of course, now that she's all excited to make the club, she's essentially ditched tsundere mode now and is fully committed to just like, bossy, leader mode. And it's funny because from this point on, she's essentially all like, she's smiling 90% of the time unless she's pissed about something, and she acts like she's all coked up. So that's her Inspire Kyon persona, and that's what she's representing with her short hair, and that's the persona she's committed to. And what's most interesting is seeing when she gets tired with that persona, or when she lets another persona slip through the cracks, and that we'll see in later episodes. And so this is interesting. Immediately, Kyon tries to see the feasibility of actually forming a club. He's so beholden to authority. He's just like, oh, you want to do this thing? Well, let me immediately check with the authority. And I love it too. He looks at the manual too. He doesn't even ask anyone. It's like he wants to take rules so literally. And of course, Haruhi just easily breaks past, whatever restrictions there are. But it's interesting too, because she also acquiesces the restrictions to some extent, like the fact that they can't become a proper club. And now it's really interesting if you look at Haruhi's, attitude towards Yuki. You'll notice that I think it's really well acted with that little gesture right there where she puts her hand on her shoulder. Haruhi is careful not to be too rough with Yuki, even if she can be still a little bossy to her. And it's funny because you'll even see here, she calls her odd. And it's funny, Kyon says, Kyon states the obvious, you're one to talk, you're odd yourself. But it's funny because, deep down, Haruhi is not truly odd. She's, she takes on a persona of oddness, whereas Yuki is truly odd. And it's interesting to see Haruhi kind of take on an attitude of pity towards that. I have a little bit of pity towards Yuki for being truly odd. And there's this sort of care not to, upset her. Which is funny because it's, it's subtle, but it's a glimpse that Haruhi can actually be, pretty considerate of others. She is doing all of this for Kyon after all, so. And so it's funny, yeah. You really hear that in the voice acting in that line. Kyon is now pumped to go to the club. He's fully caught up in Haruhi's thing. He's fully like, okay, this is definitely my way out of clown world. And it's funny because in the books too, he even straight up actively refuses Taniguchi and Kunikita's invitation to, walk home or chill after school. So he's just like, yeah, this is definitely better than, what my normal high school life would have been. He's pretty committed to this now, even if he, acts sarcastic about it the whole way through. And now the dynamics with Mikuru are very interesting because the anime does not blast the fact that Kyon is infatuated with Mikuru in your face. It's a little more subtle about it. It eases you into it a little slower. But in general, his body language is at least enough to convey that. And it's funny because when he's around Mikuru, when Kyon's around Mikuru, he is in a sense, he acts, you'll notice, very, he tries to act masculine. He tries to put on a little bit of a, I can take charge, but it never works. And it always, he basically goes into that attitude self-defeated every time. And, here's the famous moe line, which actually introduced a lot of people in the West to the term moe. It's funny because this is going off the book written in 2003, but it came out in 2006. had this story actually taken place in 2006, it's quite possible Kyon would have known what Moe is. Possibly even thanks to the fact that this show exists, which is kind of an interesting thing to wrap your head around. Now, Haruhi's relationship with Mikuru is extremely interesting because even right there, she explicitly states jealousy, and that's something I'll be talking about later too. That's jealousy is going to be a huge component to Haruhi. It's one of her defining traits, frustration and jealousy, and a lot of that she filters into her attitude towards Mikuru, and that's an interesting thing too because Mikuru, as Haruhi even says, is kind of like, she's sort of like their... Even though Yuki, Haruhi, and Mikuru are all technically Moe, Mikuru is like the most sort of stereotypically, like when you first think Moe. And so what's funny about that is Haruhi essentially expressing jealousy at the way in which Mikuru has like a Moe appeal, and the fact that Kyon is so attracted to her is essentially, anyone would be in this world would be attracted to her because she's supposed to be super attractive, but Kyon's like real infatuation with her, that's like essentially proof of his otaku-ness. And now, of course, the SOS Don, that's such a... I'm not even entirely sure how much this was intended, but it's such a significant name because it's like, it's supposed to be this absurd acronym, forced acronym. But, when you think about SOS as a save our ship distress signal, it's funny because the club really is Haruhi's distress signal. She's like, it's her distress signal on the behalf of Kyon and all the, of course, really for anyone who's, because that's you as the audience. It's also, it's also for, because the show has a meta thing where Haruhi's not only serving to try to open Kyon's mind, but she's also trying to open your mind as the viewer. But in the context of the physical narrative of the story, she's, it's her distress signal essentially on Kyon's behalf. And it's just extremely interesting, the idea of the club being a distress signal. And of course, we got the iconic Hari Hari Yukai, which is extremely interesting, the Hari Hari Yukai. Of course, because this was Yamamoto's input, I believe, because he's obsessed with dancing. But the Hari Hari Yukai, what's interesting about it, the reason it had so much charisma, I think, is because, well, it's exactly what it sounds like, and you listen to the lyrics, it's like, oh, let me show you something that doesn't suck. Let me show you something that doesn't suck ass, like Clown World. And because of that, it was so inevitable that this series would have the pull it did, not only to otaku, but to, normal fags as well, because you can't avoid it. It's talking about something it's talking about it through otaku lens, because Kyon is really, he's an otaku, he's a disenfranchised otaku, essentially. But just because Kyon is an otaku doesn't mean that his problem isn't relatable to everyone. As I said with Taniguchi, everyone wants the solution Haruhi is suggesting. It just so happens that the way, the solutions she provides are really otaku solutions. But the problem is a human problem. And Hari Hari Yukai is sort of like a suggestion of what could be. And so for that reason, it was just, its fame and its meme status was just, internationally. It was just inevitable. So let's look at some traits of Yahweh for a second. Yahweh is known for hiding his form. And that's an interesting concept because your form, knowing who you are, Yahweh says many times, like, no one who sees me can live. And what's really interesting about, his name is hidden as well. You can't know his name. Knowing the truth about someone, knowing their name or their form, that's knowing their identity. That's having a handle on who they are for sure and what they are. And once you know someone, it's just like if you're playing Yu-Gi-Oh! And you know someone's hand. You know what someone's working with. You have an in on them. They have a vulnerability now. And what's really interesting is if we go to the trait again of Haruhi, where she's not ashamed even to be seen nude. That's extremely interesting too, because again, if you look at the story of Eden with Adam and Eve, they only became ashamed of their nudity once they became vulnerable, once they were no longer invulnerable, once they were no longer immortal and not prone to illness or disease. Once they gained vulnerabilities, then nudity became something to be ashamed of, because there's now a consequence to it. There's now a consequence to being known. And notice how Haruhi bypasses that shame. Haruhi has no fear of being known. Like I said, she knows no shame. She knows no embarrassment. What's interesting about that is if we compare and contrast that to Yahweh, Yahweh knows no shame because he'll never be seen. If he was seen, he would know shame. Where as Haruhi, we can see her, and yet she still knows no shame. But what's interesting is that Haruhi, too, is very much hiding in a sense. In that Haruhi, especially as we'll see as we go on, Haruhi has many, many personas, and it's almost impossible to really say what's the true Haruhi, what's the real Haruhi, because in many ways there's really not a true Haruhi. You could almost say they're all true or none of them are true. And in that sense, like I said, symbolized by her rotating hairstyle, she really just rotates her form. She rotates a persona. There's no final Haruhi. There's no oh, you found me, game's up, you know who I am. And it's interesting too, because it's, her name is even boldly flaunted on every volume of the book, and just as the anime title. And there's no shame in that. There's a pride in it. And in fact, again, back to her body, she's happy to dress up as a bunny girl. She's proud to flaunt herself. She has this boldness to showing her forms, because in a sense each of her forms is almost a weapon. It's almost a prize that she even has these forms. It's each persona is a weapon she can use to interact with the world. And it's interesting. Contrast that with Kyon, who has no name at all. All we ever know of him ever is his nickname. I don't think there's ever even a hint as to his real name. And that's interesting because, in a sense, I mean, we achieve a couple things with Kyon being nameless. The first most obvious one is, what does it matter? Kyon's so down on himself. Who the fuck cares what my name is, kind of feeling. And at the same time, we also get a idea there where Kyon is embracing a form of ego abandonment. And that's a really interesting concept, and one I'll talk about a lot when I talk about the toxic masculinity. But by the point Kyon has met Haruhi, he's essentially a devout follower of the true God principles presented by Haruhi. And in the following of true God, in the devotion to true God, there's a type of egolessness that goes along with that. And a lot of that is because you're essentially pledging you're pledging your life to this entity, to this greater entity, and there's an egolessness that goes along with that. So that's another aspect to Kyon being nameless. And so the last thing I wanted to talk about was, here's this quote: "For thou shalt worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." And that's Exodus 34:14. So Yahweh states very boldly that he is jealous. He even is going so as far as to say, you might as well call me jealous, because that's how jealous I am. And in a sense, he's not ashamed to admit it. My identity is jealousy. And he's fine with naming himself jealous, because jealous isn't an identity in and of itself. Jealousy is not a vulnerability. Jealousy is the desire to absorb other identities that you find to be beautiful or you find to be useful, but you don't have, but you want to have, and maybe you can have. And so by being named jealous, there's really no risk in that, because it's not an identity in and of itself. It's an anti-identity. It's an identity that absorbs other identities. And that is something we can actually see in Haruhi, as I said. First of all, I pointed out that she is very much jealous of Mikuru. And again, that's an interesting concept, and that's one I want to pay a lot of attention to as Mikuru's character develops. But also, just more immediately symbolically, she does everything. She has, and that's a trait of Yahweh. Yahweh has his whole, I do everything. I'm the everything God. It's not like the pagan gods who correspond to a specific archetype. Yahweh has no archetype. He's just everything. He's anything and he's anything and everything as he needs it. And Haruhi is very much the same way. She needs something, she just whips it out. She can do anything that anyone else can do. She can do a lot of things better than anyone else can do. She's just we have to assume that there's essentially two sides to that. There's the metaphysical side, where she has those traits because she represents God. And then there's the physical side, where she made an effort to take on these traits due to an underlying jealousy, due to a desire to be everything, essentially. And that's a really interesting concept, too, and one we'll see as her relationship develops with Kyon, because there's obviously a specific utility that Haruhi finds in being everything. There's clearly this, especially if you're to think about it like Haruhi is in a battle with Yahweh. In a sense, it's interesting, because if Yahweh has dominance in Clown World, then that's who Haruhi's fighting against. And for Haruhi to fight Yahweh, it's not unlikely that her first response would be, well, let me take on his traits. Just like Yahweh wanted to take on the traits of the gods he killed, Haruhi's going to want to take on the traits of the god she's going to try to kill. Very interestingly is that trait, that jealousy trait, that's actually a much more feminine trait than a masculine trait. So it actually suits Haruhi a lot more naturally, a lot more comfortably than it suits a patriarchal god like Yahweh. And that's something to think about, because that trait being more appropriate for Haruhi also means it's going to be more powerful. And that's something we'll explore as it goes on as well. The last thing to know, a really interesting trait, is that if you picked it up in this episode, Haruhi mentions how she'd be fine. She hints at a little bit of bisexuality. She especially the way you see she has this real interest in Mikuru's body as well. She's definitely not, lacking bisexual tendencies. And that's an interesting trait, again, because that's a very egotistical trait, this bisexuality she's expressing. She says, oh, I'd be fine with even being in a relationship with a girl, as long as she's interesting. And again, that's corresponds to the trait I was just saying, the do everything trait. But it also is just a really bold expression too of the hermaphroditic moe quality I talk about, where female characters will possess masculine traits as well. So, all in all, we're going to see how Haruhi, Kyon, and the meta-narrative develop, and exactly how the story states the problem that specifically otaku are facing in clown world, but really anyone. And then the solutions it starts to suggest, the way out, so to speak.